former pastor of the soon-to-be President Barack Obama. And Barack Obama had written a book, and Jeremiah Wright helped him come up with the title for that book. Jeremiah Wright had married Barack Obama and his wife. He baptized his children. So he was pretty instrumental in Barack Obama's religious life. And these are some quotes from the sermon. One was, "Not God bless America, but God damn America." And the other was, "We have supported state terrorism against the Palestinians and black South Africans, and now we're indignant because of the stuff we have done is now coming home to roost." Those were the two quotes that usually appeared out of context on television. Okay, some more background. Prior to the scandal, as I said before, he was the pastor of Trinity United Church for more than 30 years. And the video was actually one of the ones that was sold at his church. Usually after each sermon, you could buy a copy of the video in their store or whatever they had at their church. So this was the situation. Although he had already announced his retirement a month after the controversy, a keen interest still existed in the true identity of Wright and what effects, if any, it had on Barack Obama's political ideology. So some of the framing that you saw at that time was, if he's Barack Obama's pastor, then Barack Obama probably feels the same way. Barack Obama is probably also a racist. That's what we saw a lot of that. That was some of the framing, but other people also brought up the point, well, that's his pastor, and people don't necessarily have to agree with their pastor. So we saw different types of frames at that time. So our study, as I said before, it looks at opinion articles to see if those were similar. Well, our first study looked at the framing in traditional articles, and this one looked at the framing in editorials. And a review of the literature revealed that articles that were written on this situation before, they usually focused on the background and motives of Reverend Wright. They also focused on his role as a preacher of black liberation theology, and the ethics of covering the story, and the role of Wright's speech and the ensuing coverage in Obama's campaign. Those were what other articles focused on. And our 2009 study found that the news coverage was similar in both the minority and mainstream presses at that time. They covered the situation similarly, although we thought they would have different frames. Most of the time they contained similar framing in the articles. Okay, the mainstream press is identified as targeting the general population and focusing on topics that would be of interest to the general population. And they're generally perceived as being objective, the mainstream media. And so for the purpose of this study, we said the mainstream media denotes news outlets that produce content that is specifically conceived and designed to reach and appeal to a large audience. Conversely, we define the black press as newspapers and magazines that are aimed at black readers that speak to their issues. And that's just some literature that we included in our paper, Dates and Barlow and Fellows, where they actually talk about how black newspapers usually focus on issues that are of interest to the black population. And that just makes economic sense. If your advertisers are going to want you to focus on a certain group if you're supposed to be a black newspaper. Okay, so previous studies that have compared black press and mainstream media, they usually conclude that they had different frames as would be expected. You would expect them to have different frames. And although overt racism is not often found when they cover similar stories, they still have different frames. And these are just some examples. Raslow and Aoria, 1994, they found that black press framed the labor issue by its impact on black people, while the mainstream newspaper framed it as an issue that touches the lives of people from all lifestyles. So those are two very different frames. And similarly, Towner, Clausen, and Waltenberg found that minority press coverage relied on different sources and shaped the stories to provide more context and depth in order to illustrate the impact of the decision on its audiences. So they included more details and more information about that topic. Okay, previous studies on religion have found that usually when the topic of religion comes up, people don't necessarily focus on the religious aspect of it, they focus on the conflict. In this case, rather than focusing on the religious aspect of Reverend Wright's comments, they usually focused on race, and said he's a racist, and since he's racist, then President Obama is probably also racist. Editorials, several studies have focused specifically on editorials, and their findings have included that newspapers focus on the general issue or general perspectives, but editorials can bring in more details. They can bring in some different perspectives that are not covered by the newspaper, because these perspectives may not be considered mainstream, but they can actually be covered in editorials because that's what you expect. You expect editorials to bring a different slant. This is just an example. Richardson and Landendorfer in 2004 looked at editorial responses to the ruling on affirmative action, and they found that the more diverse the newsroom staff was relative to the market, the more likely the publication was to frame the editorials in favor of diversity. So that makes a big difference. Okay, so these were our research questions. The first one was, will the choices of sources differ significantly between black and mainstream newspapers? The second question, will the frames used in editorials about the Wright controversy differ significantly between the black and mainstream presses? Those were our two questions that we looked at. For our methods, it was a content analysis. We looked at black press newspapers that included Chicago Defender, the Washington Informer, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Atlanta Tribune, and the New York Beacon. And we selected those newspapers because they're in areas where there's a large black population. And for the mainstream publications, we just matched those with the ones that were in the same cities. So that's how we came up with our samples. Okay, so in all, we looked at 140 editorials, and we basically looked at all of that was the whole sample we looked at all the editorials that we found. And we trained students to code those editorials, and these were our findings. There was no significant difference found in the use of citizen, police, clergy, politician, activist, attorney, sources. There was no difference in the occurrence of those sources in black press versus mainstream media. However, there was a significant difference in the usage of agency sources such as the NAACP. So black press was more likely to use NAACP or organizations that have a predominantly black membership. Okay, so that was a key difference. Another difference in black press, 1/3 of the editorials and nearly 1/2 of the news articles used the media as a source, and they usually criticize mainstream media for its coverage of the incident. And that goes back to what I said at first. They focused on the fact that first of all, they played it over and over and over, but then also they played it out of context. Okay, so we coded 13 frames and found significant differences in 9 of those frames. Several of the frames were related to religion, and we found those to be significantly different. So the black press newspapers were more likely to focus on religion than mainstream media. That was one of our most significant findings. And 38% of the mainstream articles did not mention religion at all in editorials, which we thought that goes back to our literature that says they're more likely to focus on controversy than focus on religion. We also found significant differences in coverage for statements that Wright's comments were taken out of context. The media was deliberately trying to damage Obama's reputation, and controversy is an example of political mudslinging. And finally, Obama did not handle the controversy appropriately. Those were some frames that we found significant differences in. And indications, main thing that we thought would be important to take from this study is that religious matters may be more important and a more important part of the public sphere for readers of the black press than they are for the mainstream media, which was indicated in our findings. But we also conclude that more research needs to be done in this area. And so these were some other implications. There were definitely differences in the media framing of this topic based on the type of newspapers that we looked at. The black press was, of course, more likely to focus on the black perspective. And then also the other implication was mainstream media is less likely to focus on religion. Okay?
Leave a lack of context in the coverage. I mean, he is, I believe, a Reverend Dr. Jeremiah, and he is spoke to the whole Unitarian Universalist Association at their great big gathering, national gathering, right before the controversy, and people were just incredulous that he was treated that way in the media. It's a shame. I feel shamed because that happened to him. And I've always thought that the second thing that he did, when he did that second speech where he was even worse than the first one, that he did that so that he was falling on his sword, so that Obama could distance himself from him, because it just kept going on and on and on. So if I can apologize for all white people, I find it shocking.
I don't think you can apologize for Fox News.
I take no credit for that.
We actually talked about that a little bit in
One quick response.
Okay.
There was a question as to how we continue this process, and I think because we're the core of communication on the ground in America, that this continued research in the realm of racial discourse within the context of this interest group, I think is significantly important, and we've probably got another 100 years of discussion with it.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we talked about it at the MAC division meeting last night, and also we had a panel discussion yesterday that also focused on research that matters, for underrepresented groups, and how we needed to continue this and continue to have a forum at AEJ as well to discuss this research that matters. So yes, that's very good. We'll keep it going. Yes. Other questions? Yes. Let me see.
I think she had a
Oh,
comment.
Amanda.
I was just going to say, we talked about that a little bit in our first paper that dealt with the news articles.
Oh, great.
And sort of, I think the conclusion that we came to was mostly that it had a lot to do with the decline of specialty reporting, and that the media was not willing to try to put the comments in context because they couldn't understand them, apart from in a surface level.
Yeah, it's interesting that his name is Jeremiah, because it was such a Jeremiah. And that in the land of free speech, that the things that he said they were beyond the bounds of the expressible. That this is what Chomsky's talking about. Everybody had to dump on them right away because we couldn't possibly listen to what he was saying. So, anyway.
I was curious about your first paper. Did you all look at whether coverage appeared on the front page and where that appeared on the front page?
Okay. We looked at location.
It wasn't significantly different between the two, I don't think.
Did you looked at news in the first
News articles in the
And it
first
wasn't,
opinion.
because most of them put it on the front page at first, and then, of course, as the news grew older, then they took it off the front page, but it wasn't significantly different between black press and mainstream media.
Okay. And then I was curious also about the religious aspect, having worked in newsrooms for about 20 years. I did notice that there wasn't a major influence of religion among the reporters. I don't know if any research had been done related to how journalists of all races follow, or whether religion is an important part of their lives. And maybe that was a part of the reason that it was put in context of political rather than religious.
Yeah, we didn't look at any literature on that, but I think a lot of newspapers have religion desks, or they have a religion section, and so if it relates to religion, they're going to just stick it in that section. But since this was about politics, it had the political angle, and they put it on the front page, and they kind of stayed away from that religious angle. But as far as people being religious, I think African Americans are often perceived as being a little more religious anyway. And so that's probably why the black press covered religion more than mainstream media.
To what extent is all of what you're discussing a strategy to sell newspapers and magazines and programs?
Yeah, it's demographics. You have to relate to your audience if you want to sell newspapers.
Yeah, because maybe we're getting too serious about something. These guys are sitting in the newsroom going to sell their papers, and here we are now weeping. We should not weep.
No, I mean, that's part of the discussion of the context of this behavior, because when the story was moved from...
Do you think was driven by PAC journalism?
PAC journalism?
Yes.
I think a lot of it was driven by PAC journalism because you can just look at the difference in frames. You know, Fox News, they knew that if they played that over and over, they would have a higher viewership because people, when they heard "God damn America," it was like, you know, this is against our country, and so if we play this over and over, people are going to tune in. They're going to want to hear more about Jeremiah Wright. So I think PAC journalism and how people cluster together in their beliefs, you know, liberal versus conservative, I think it could frame that issue differently, and I think conservative sources tended to play it up more so than the liberal.
So you would say then that a lot of the coverage was motivated by different assignment desks saying, listen, you know, we've got to get out a story that matches, say, what the Chicago Tribune is saying, or what the Washington Post is saying, or what the Detroit Free Press is saying. We've got to get. You think a lot of that happened in this instance?
Well, I don't know if they would put a label on it, but I think reporters for those agencies or journalists, they know what they're supposed to. They know what angle they're supposed to play up. I don't think you necessarily have to tell them, you know, that they need to play up that angle. So I think if they asked them to go out and cover it, they would do that automatically, cover it from their perspective, or perspective that their news outlet would expect from them. I don't know if you agree with that or.
No, it's just that it's like I was having a discussion with someone the other day, and I said, you know, one of the worst beats you can have if you walk in Washington, for instance, is the White House beat. Mm-hmm. You don't see a lot of original coverage coming out of the White House because your goal is to make sure you don't get beat. Mm-hmm. It's not to do enterprise. It's not to do. It's to make sure you don't get beat because you travel in packs. You're stuffed there in the White House press office, and that's all you're doing. So there's and so I was just kind of wondering if the same type of pack mentality applied to the Jeremiah Wright coverage, because I know as a reporter, I had instances where editors would make me cover something, even though it really wasn't a story. Mm-hmm. They would make me cover it just because the competitor had it, the St. Pete Times had it, or the Detroit News had it, or the Akron-Beacon Journal had it, so we've got to have it too.
Well, that might be true at first, but I think once you get that initial story and you've already done your part, as long as you say, well, we've already had a piece on that. But this was a little bit different because you had some outlets that covered it over and over and over. They continued to cover it even after they did that initial story. So I think that's true in the beginning, you know, that pack mentality that you're talking about, where everybody has to get that first piece in. That scoop, they don't want to be scooped, but I think after the story has been submitted, then the extent to how much coverage you give that topic is going to differ based on the outlet.
One quick question. The editorials, you bring up a good point, whether they were the editorial from the newspaper or were they op-ed pieces from Wire, you know, Wire.
They were
columns.
editorials from the newspaper.
Okay.
We specifically focused on those from the newspaper.
Although they were both editorials and columns.
Op-ed columns. Okay.
Mary has a question. I'm going to ask this real quick. Did you ever find out how this broke in terms of, did Fox News buy the tape from the, because that was the thing.
I think it was ABC, wasn't it? Yeah, ABC released the first tape.
And did they say that the ABC reporter bought the tape from the church? Because that story was in the media that I think what I heard was a Fox reporter bought the tape from the church. And they saw, you know, maybe it was CBS.
Well, if you read David Remnick's book, Crossing the Bridge, which was published, I believe, last year, the account that he gives, which I think was also reported in the New Yorker, and he says that what happened was Brian Ross, who was the chief investigative reporter at ABC News, he and his team got a tip about Jeremiah Wright. So they now went and bought a bunch of tapes and over the weekend analyzed them. And that's how they ended up breaking the story.
And I figured that it had to be someone within the church. I'm thinking.
Yeah, but those tapes are for sale, so
yes,
that's
true. But I'm saying that if you're there every week listening to it,
right,
then I'm thinking that has to be somebody like that breaks it. You know, that calls and gives a tip. I'm thinking, because I mean we do that in my church too. You know, same thing. But I would know the you know, archives of what my pastor has said and that kind of thing. That's interesting. Yes, Mary.
I'm wondering how much of this is part of a theme or a frame, if you will, in relation to Obama himself, because we saw a very similar thing when Michelle Obama said, for the first time, I'm proud to be an American. And we saw that coverage again and again, and again, more coverage about his birth certificate. He's not really an American. So how much is this just part, I know it sounds very conspiratorial, but how much is this part of a whole frame that the media has about the president? That he's somehow not American, somehow he's not proud of America. So his minister's not proud, his wife's not proud. He's not even an American, why should he be proud? But how much is this part of a whole
Even her
frame?
dissertation, they dug up Michelle Obama's dissertation where she talked about being black at a predominantly white university, and they brought out that same frame. I think it was definitely a part of the coverage prior to the election, because people wanted to say he's not going to be good for the United States. You shouldn't vote for him, and that was an effective way to do that, was to bring up all the issues that you just
I think he said similar stuff with Kennedy too, but I didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was right.